researching the females in your tree and trying to unravel some mysteries of those elusive females that we have in your tree. And that will be our last one of the season. And then also on March 21st, so before you come to find your ancestors, we have a history fair at the Expo Center. For those who have attended the history fairs before, it used to be at City Center, but this time downtown is doing something a little bit different, so they're going to do it at the Expo Center. It's going to start at 9 in the morning, go till 3, but of course you got to leave early in order to come here and find your ancestors at 2. So now on to our speaker. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Friends of the Library who have generously offered to bring this speaker here for us today. So our speaker today is Dave Miller. And Dave has been researching his family history for over 30 years, and he's known as the Ancestor Guy. He's a nationally recognized author, speaker, and genealogist, holding a professional learning certificate in genealogical studies in Irish records from the National Institute for Genealogical Studies. He's especially experienced in genealogy research in the U.S. Midwest and knowledgeable in American and Irish records. Dave has also published articles on family history and is a speaker on various genealogical topics. He has also emceed Irish genealogy conferences and conducted research for episodes of the TV show Dead Files on the Travel Channel. So everybody welcome Dave.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you showing up today. And thanks to Katie for inviting me. And it has been an interesting day. So last week, and I'll talk about this very briefly, I was doing actually for a friend of mine, he asked me if I could do some work for him. So I was looking up this one record, and I think I would mention it to you earlier. I just found I wasn't doing really well finding anything, and I found a few things, and all of a sudden, there's the marriage record from this county in Longford in the western portion of Ireland, and I just like bingo, you know. It was one of those moments that, and I usually don't get that excited about when I find a record, but this was really, so I've had an interesting week so far. So anyway, thanks for coming on out here. We're going to be talking a lot about Irish records, but maybe a little bit about the migration of why people moved around and things like that, where you can find some of these records. I ask that usually to people not videotape. Katie has permission to do that, so and take some pictures, and we'll post it up on the website. Originally, I'm from Evanston, Illinois, but as some of you probably know, my family comes from Clintonville. I've had family here in Appleton, and I got some family in Menasha, so this is like second home. And it's kind of funny because I just came back from Ireland a couple months ago where my cousin, son just got married, and he was dropping me off at the hotel, and I was trying to explain to him the street where I was going to. And I said, well, yeah, you make a right here over on Talbot Street. He looks at me and goes, I live here, and you know more than I do about, you know. So anyway, I went and got my degree at McMurray, my bachelor's, my master's at Sangamon State University, and it's now called University of Illinois Springfield. And then just 5 years ago, I can't believe it's been 5 years, I got my certificate from the National Institute for Genealogical Studies, and it was like a 3-year program. And that was in November of, it's coming up to 6 years now, November of 14. So I've been at this for quite a while. I have been, as many of you know, worked in television, worked in radio, have been doing family research. I started the business about 3 years ago. And so I've been doing a bunch of different topics. We talk about a lot of things. Most of what I talk about is on Irish records because that's been that's what I concentrated my research on. I do a lot of stuff on, some of you might know William Ralston. I got his book over there. And William and I were having lunch one day when I was on Belfast, and I said, he's been concentrating on Irish and Northern Ulster records, and I said, well, what I do is I help Americans and Canadians before they go over there, and they come up to you and say, do you have anything on the O'Reilly family? I said, I help them kind of steer away from that so that when they come to you, they've got some specific questions. And he goes, you're the greatest. So if William Ralston can say that, that's all good. So anyway, so we're going to talk today a little bit about Irish records. And as I was mentioning before the program started, many times Irish, or not so much Irish record, but in particular Irish records, but English and even in Central Europe, the religious records preceded the civil records. They were the civil record. So you won't see a big changeover until probably the 1800s. So a lot of times the church records, and depending upon, in the case of, say, Ireland, where the Church of Ireland was the civil record. So, and then it wasn't until after the penal laws were relaxed in the late 1700s that you started seeing individual churches begin with their own records. They were allowed to do that. So in the early 1800s, you would begin to see more church records become available. In the United States, that was also true. In some cases of New England, you'll see church records preceding civil records. So, one thing that, and this big bingo that I had yesterday or on Thursday regarding this record led me to some other records. To this point, I kind of hit a brick wall, which all of us have hit at one point in time. But what happened was, this gave you the name of the fathers, it gave you the occupations, it told me what townlands both the groom and the bride were living in. So this can lead to a lot of other records that you didn't know even existed up to this point. So they're very important. I mentioned that in the US, church records, some cases preceded many of the civil records, especially as I mentioned in the Northeast and New England in particular. What you can get out of church records are birth, some baptismal records. The baptismal records and the birth can be in one, is what I was mentioning earlier to you. You'll find that the birth may have occurred the day before the baptism. In some cases, it occurred the day of the birth. So they didn't waste a lot of time. You know, they were sure, especially with the children, being able to survive the birth and being able to survive whatever was going on in the environment at the time. Baptism usually occurred immediately after. So you can get marriage, in some cases death and burial records, communion, confirmation, and especially in Protestant records, you'll find vestry minutes. That will give you when a person was admitted into the church, the conversion, the church financial records. You may find out that one of your ancestors was an elder in that particular church. You might find more in the church census. I went through that the other day on one record. So the records may contain details of the ancestor. You may find out that they were the pastor of that particular church, depending upon the religion. So keep in mind that some of these records exist. Some of these have kind of been put into different archives. Some of them haven't been put into archives. And sometimes you'll find, depending upon the diocese or the religion you're talking about, there is no archive, you know, so you're going to have to find the local church to be able to figure out. One of the important things, too, that you're going to notice when it comes to religious records is that the ancestor in Europe or in Ireland or in England or in Scotland may have been another religion, and then when they came to the US or Canada, they converted to another religion. So you'll find that in a lot of cases. In the case of the Irish ancestors, and I found this in my own family, they belonged to the Church of Ireland or the Anglican Church, and then they converted when they came to the US to the Methodist Church. So you'll see a lot of that. So in some cases, you have to be pretty open-minded as to, you know, what they may have gone to, what religion they may have belonged to in Europe, and then what they became when they moved to the US. What church was nearby their house? You know, if they came from a small town, that's also very important, because they may have been living like a block away from the church and they decided, well, let's just go here, it's closer. And transportation wasn't quite that easy as it is today back in the 1800s. So we'll start with the Catholic records. And I know some of you are going to walk away from this and say, oh, this was wonderful. And some of you are going to walk away and going, oh, well, this wasn't quite so wonderful. Because each diocese and each archdiocese are going to have a different plan when it comes to their records. And I see a lot of heads bobbing around. So you know what I'm talking about. And it may change overnight depending upon a new bishop or a new cardinal that comes into that diocese or archdiocese. So you don't know. what the plan is. Check their website, see what it is. In some cases, they do allow visitors to come in and look at the records. In many cases, they still don't. Church records are something that is still very new to getting this out into the genealogy world. Some of these records, as you'll see in just a minute, are now available. They've been digitized, like the Archdiocese of Chicago, in Boston, and we'll talk about that as well. Just to give you some examples of where you can find some of these records. Milwaukee has, they've started to work with UWM a little bit as far as getting some of their records digitized. So those are some places you can find as far as getting, some records are available. You're not going to find everything in some of these digitized, and there's still, it's a process. So some of these churches are just now starting to get this information. I can remember 25 years ago, do you remember Father Jude Hahn? Anybody remember him at all? He was kind of in this area for a while, and he taught down at the seminary down near Fond du Lac, but he was really the one that kind of got me into that, and my cousin in Ireland were the ones that kind of got me started on this a long time ago. But he would go and he would say, all right, I'm going to start finding some of these records in the Milwaukee Archdiocese. Well, they let him in because he was a clergy member, whereas they wouldn't probably let me in at one time. But Father Jude was really, he was a good example of somebody who really were in research career. So I learned a lot from him. But anyway, the individual parish and the diocese will determine whether you can find a record or not. Records, as I mentioned, are now being digitized at various sites. And in some countries, some of the Catholic records were written in Latin. In some portions of the United States, they're in English. So we're going to go through some screenshots of different archives, websites, so that you can kind of see what they look like, and you see what the procedures are in some of them. All right? Let's take a look, first of all, at the Diocese of Green Bay. And really, they've changed their website. I have an apology to make right off the bat right here. Their site changed. So this is the new site over here in the bottom, and I have a big shot of it so that you can see it here in a second if you want to write it down. The Green Bay Archdiocese they probably are one of the better ones as far as getting in and visiting their archive. I think most of the others in Wisconsin won't allow you. They will research for you, but they won't allow you to go in and go through the records. Green Bay's will. So that is a possibility. Now, you have to make a reservation, and there's a contribution that you make. If it's a half day, it's going to be $10. If it's a full day, it's $15. So they will also research for you, and they have an online site that you can get into. And like I said, this is all really new for some of these churches and dioceses. They're just now starting to get into responding to people's requests for records for genealogy purposes. So you have to be really patient with them. And their job obviously is not to do genealogy work, but it is to archive the records of that particular diocese or archdiocese. In this case, this is the request. That takes you right over there, and you can do an online request, or you can call our number, and I have that on here, I think, as well, and you can get in there and call them up and make a reservation. The other dioceses aren't quite that way. Milwaukee, they will work with you. They have records prior to 1920. Keep in mind, too, you're only going up to about 1920, 1930, and that's true for a lot of, not only here in the U.S., but also in Europe. You don't see many records available beyond, say, like 1926 or something. Yes?
I'm not Catholic, so what does archdiocese mean? Does that cover the
Archdiocese usually contains a larger city, say like Chicago, Boston, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee. Those are archdioceses. They have a cardinal that runs the archdiocese.
Okay, so
in a smaller area, a
a
bishop will run it, and those are usually dioceses. In Wisconsin, we have a diocese in Milwaukee, Wausau, La Crosse, Madison, and in the archdiocese in Milwaukee.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what you'll find is records that only date up to about 1920 or so. They will not allow you to search at their archives, but they will research for you. One of the things that some of these diocese and archdiocese, and I've even seen this in some of the Protestant churches as well. They've come up with like resource guides, and they will help you if you're looking for somebody, say like in Ozaki County. You can, let me go back. Yeah, there it is. You can find, say in that case right here, say in Ozaki County, they will tell you what parishes exist and where you might be able to find some of the records for that parish, the address for that parish, things like that. So, you know, it's good to get on their sites because they can kind of direct you what churches are available. And you're probably saying, well, I know what city they came from. I don't know what church they went to. We can find that out too. There's ways of finding that in just a second. Here's their address, and they have an online request. They will take a mail request, but most of it's an online request, and then as you saw, there's also a fee for that. I believe it's like $20, $25. Most of them you'll find are going to be between $20 to $30. And as in many research, whether you go to a public archive or a church archive or wherever you're planning to go, be as specific as you can in your questions. Going up to the desk and saying, I want to know as much as I can about the O'Reilly family isn't going to get you very far. And unfortunately, they're probably going to take that request and kind of put it over on the table and say, okay, I'll get to that later. And you probably won't hear much anytime soon. If you have a specific question, I'm looking for Bob Smith, he died in 1922, do you have a burial or death record of him? That will get you someplace and it'll get you, and contribute to the parish or to the archdiocese if they require that, or the diocese archive, whatever your plan is, then you'll get much further along. They talk about the holdings that they have available. Records of closed parishes. That's probably what you'll find in a lot of these archives. Some of the parishes that closed in maybe the 1920s or so. I can think of one around Cedarburg that closed down. Those records are probably going to be there. They're probably going to be on microfilm, so that's why you probably won't have a chance to get in there. Now, again, that depends upon where you're going and how available. And keep in mind, some of these libraries their archives are really small. It's just a matter of archiving the church records or the parish records or the diocesan records, whatever the plan is. And there's really very little room to research. So there's not a lot of space to spread out and do a lot of work. So you really, that's probably mostly why a lot of people, a lot of archives won't allow on-site research. St. Francis Seminary records are also available there if you had maybe an ancestor that was a priest. That might be a good place to find a record or two of them. One of the neat things, and I use this quite a bit, is the Catholic Cemetery Index. And you can search, we'll start with the last name and the first name. And the really neat thing about this is that you can go in there and it'll tell you all the different people with that surname and what cemeteries they were buried at. But then, if you go into that, say like Bob Jones, you go into Bob Jones, they'll tell you who's buried on either side of that person. So if you think Aunt Molly was right next to Bob Jones, then if Molly's name, you know you got the right person then. So they really have done a nice job with this. Archdiocese of Chicago, and I'm pretty familiar with them, they have made their records somewhat available. Well, most of it, again, is available online. There are cemetery records that they have, but there's also different sources that you can find a lot of the cemetery records. Here's what their website looks like. They do offer a genealogical certificate for sacramental registers. For mostly, it's going to be people like yourself or your mother or father or something like that. So those are probably what you're going to get out of that particular archive. However, they have what's called, I'm going to pop this up right here. This gentleman right here, Jack McCarr, who wrote in 1990 locations of Chicago Roman Catholic churches that existed between 1850 and 1900. And it's a really great resource if you're looking at Chicago Catholic churches and has the address of them, and if the churches still exist, the phone numbers where you can contact information. The other thing, and this is, it got revised in 1997, but you can get it downloaded right off of the Archdiocese website, so it's a really handy thing to have. Also, RootsWeb has a site of Chicago City Catholic churches, and you can scroll down. If you know the name of the church or you have an idea, you can see the, whoops. Let's go back to this again. If you know the idea where the church where they belong to, or the community they lived in, say like they lived in South Lawndale, you could always check Assumption. You know, there's a possibility. The thing in Chicago, and I found this in a couple of situations, is that I went to St. Jerome. Well, there are two St. Jeromes in Chicago. One was on the far north side, one was on the far south side. So you have to kind of figure out which one you need to go to. But this will give you some information as well. Family Church has started to put a lot of the Chicago Archdiocese records on their website. So some of those records have been digitized. As I mentioned, the larger Catholic archdiocese has some of the records on sites like this by Family Search, which is out of Salt Lake City. So you'll find some baptismal records there, you'll find some burial records there, and if you go into their wiki, it will kind of tell you what's available. You can also just go search and call up the person's name and just say they lived in Chicago, Illinois, and it will tell you if they've got the records available. So that's also a good resource. There's a book, and I'll mention it, and I forgot it, so I have a second apology to make. But the book is called Graveyards of Chicago, and it talks about all the graveyards and all the cemeteries that exist not only in Cook County, not only in the 5-county area of Chicago, but in most of northern Illinois. And the book is called, again, Graveyards of Chicago. And I can't remember offhand, there were the dual authors in that book. But it will tell you where you can find some of the records available, how to get a hold of that particular cemetery, what years the cemetery existed. In some cases, they tell you who, like Jack Brickhouse was buried in I think it was All Saints Cemetery in the northwest suburbs. I didn't know Jack Brickhouse was buried there. Jack Brickhouse was the Chicago Cubs radio announcer back in the 60s, and TV announcer for a long time too. Well, anyway, he's buried there. Al Capone is buried at a cemetery out on the west side of Chicago. So, there's stuff like that you'll find. But as far as your family is concerned, you may be able to get some information out of those individual cemeteries. And it includes not just Catholic or Protestant cemeteries, it includes all the Jewish cemeteries on the west side. So if you're interested in some of those information, you can find it. The Archdiocese of Boston, the reason I mention this is because this was another situation where the Archdiocese allowed the New England Historical Genealogical Society to digitize their records and make them available. This is the site right here, and this is an ongoing project. I talked to one of the people, actually we were sharing emails back and forth about a couple months ago, and she was telling me that they have, I think they were like 50, they're about halfway done with the project. They have some records, and I was looking through a few this past week in Watertown, Massachusetts. They do have some records of various churches there. So you can get on here and find some, this is a paid site, so you have to have a subscription in order to belong to that. Family churches, not the case, that's free. And we get into Protestant records. As I mentioned, some of these are available at the UWM Library Archives. You can there's not a lot there, but you can see, they have a genealogy, a link right there. You can get in there and it kind of give you a little bit more an idea of what records are available. There are a number of churches that have archives available in the U.S. as well. This is the one for the Presbyterian Church records, and I have most of these are on that handout that you can find over there. So that is one location you can find In a lot of places, you're gonna find that they have just the record of the pastor, which pastor that individual belonged to, what church that individual belonged to, and some records. So again, if your ancestor maybe have been an elder or a pastor at one church, you may find a record of them at that particular archive. Same thing with the Lutheran Church. Their site at elca.org, and they have an archive as well. They will take reference inquiries, and they're out of Elk Grove Village. Again, a lot of these won't allow people to come in and personally search the records, but if you write to them or email them or fill out the request form on the request site, you can probably get some information from them as well. Methodist Church, pretty much the same scenario, not much of a change there. One of the Baptist church records from the American Baptist Historical Society was really interesting to see, because what they do is they tell you what we can answer and what we can't answer. So in this case, they say, hey, send all the information you have on the Doe family. I'm looking for all the names of the parents of John Doe. They're not going to be able to answer something like that. And they're pretty upfront. I really think this is really neat. They tell you all the things that you can find from that particular archive. Church records, and they said, because marriage is not regarded as a sacrament, Baptist churches traditionally they have never kept marriage records. So you're not going to find somebody. So this is a good resource if you need to go and find a record, if that record's even available. So that's one place. The United Church of Christ, they have an archive as well, and they do have an click record group access link, and right there, so you can kind of get an idea of the church record spreadsheet and what may be available at that particular archive. As I mentioned, some of the church records are available at Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past, and as I mentioned to you a little while ago, some of the English records you can find, civil and church records you can find at findmypast.uk. So there's Find My Past, you can get into findmypast.com, and then it'll ask you want Irish records or English records. So there's a findmypast.ie or findmypast.uk, so you can find some records out of there as well. Okay, I did that one right. Okay, let's take a look at some other countries and see how that compares to what we're doing here. Canadian church records. What I found was they told you to contact the local church or the local public library, which sounds like, okay, I already knew that, but actually it's a good idea, because sometimes the church will give the archive records to the local library. So if you're talking about Toronto or any place in Ontario or Manitoba or someplace like that, you might check the local public library, get a hold of them, and see where they might tell you where the records are located, if nothing else. All right, so much for that. All right, let's go to Europe. How many of you have been to Europe lately? Okay, good. All right. Let's take a look at the Irish church records. And obviously this is my area, so I kind of know, I'll probably dwell with this a little bit more than what you want to know. But anyway, what I always find fascinating when I start talking about the religions of Ireland, of all the different religions that were out there at the time. And you can find most of the records, especially Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and Moravian, are going to be in Northern Ireland. So they're going to end up at the one archive in Northern Ireland in Belfast, which is called the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, or PRONI. The other location, you'll find some Church of Ireland records at the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin. So that will give you some helpful. But the Church of Ireland also has their own archive and their own site, and it's called the Representative Church Body Library in South End of Dublin. And it's a very small building, but that's where they archive all their records. They've started to digitize some of these records about 10, 15 years ago. Actually, I went back further than that. But if you get on their website, they have a specific website for it. You can find out what parishes they have digitized. They will tell you what records are available. And as we were talking before, the fire, the Four Courts fire of 1922, destroyed a lot of the Church of Ireland records. So there was a lot of them that didn't exist. What we found out in the last few years is that there was some records that were copies made before they handed them over to the archives, and these remained in local custody, or they were in the local regional archive somewhere in the outside of what was housed in. Catholic records were never archived at Four Courts building. Some wills were archived in the Four Courts building. Those were destroyed. But there have been other wills that have been put to other locations and have been in local custody, and so those records are available. So again, you have to be open-minded when you look at some of these other countries. The penal laws went into effect in the 1600s. That restricted many other religions other than the Church of Ireland from holding records. So in the case of Ireland, all you had was Church of Ireland records. In many cases, a lot of Catholic families would have their child baptized in the Church of Ireland so that when they grew up, they might have an opportunity of leasing property. Because during the famine especially, or even prior to that, in the 1700s, many were not allowed, many Catholics were not allowed, and this also included Presbyterians as well. So during I know we talk about the Ulster plantation in the 1500s when James I had everybody who were Catholic and weren't members of the Anglican Church pushed out towards Galway and down to the south, and the Cork, places like that, as a result of Oliver Cromwell and his New Model Army, when they swept that whole area just to bring in people from Scotland and England so that they were more favorable to the crown. This is what was going on. So this was a major event that happened to people who were Catholics. They went through a lot of issues, and so when we talk about the troubles from 30 years ago, a lot of this dates back to what happened in the 1500s. So something to keep in mind. All right, Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church, civil parishes were often different than religious parishes. In Ireland, you'll have a Catholic parish, you'll have a Church of Ireland parish, and you'll have a civil parish, and they could cross over. So when you know what the civil parish is, you have to look to see what the religious parish, depending upon what religion. If somebody asks me about Irish family or Irish ancestors, I'll say, what religion were they? Because that'll determine whether what records you need to look at. The project has been, it's a fascinating project they've been going through. They have birth, marriage, and some burial record transcriptions that are available at ireland.anglican.org. And Mark Williams started the project, actually started in England and then came to Ireland and worked on that back in 1990. So this has been really a long-going and ongoing project, but it has been really interesting to see what they've come up with in the last few years. You can also find some records on the government website, which is called irishgenealogy.ie. That's run by the Irish government. They have some church records, and they have a lot of civil records. So keep in mind, some of this only dates back into the early 1800s, and depending upon the area, if it's like Dublin or Cork, places like that, you're going to find some records that may date earlier than that. As I mentioned, Prony has a lot of church records. Unfortunately, a lot of them are on microfilm, so unless you know somebody who goes there often, then you probably will have to contact the Ulster Historical Foundation or somebody up there that would be able to research for you. They have almost all the Church of Ireland parishes on microfilm, and I believe they have almost all of the Methodist records. They have most of the Presbyterian records as well from there. This is what it looks like, and this is from the Representative Church Body Library site. This is just a transcription of marriage records that date back into the 1800s, early 1800s. So you can kind of see it's not like the original record, which is right here. So you kind of see from 1848 February, Mary Bright and James O'Keefe got married in it's like 1848. And then looks like John Hanlon and William Connell were the witnesses to that wedding. So you can kind of see that you're kind of at the mercy of the pastor or the person, the clerk who wrote the records, and you're going to find that too when we get into German records here in a second. So the Catholic records, as I mentioned, as the penal laws were relaxed in the late 1700s, Catholic and mostly the Protestant dissenters, Presbyterian records started to begin in that time frame, and the registers.nli.ie is where you'll find Catholic records that date back, in some cases, into the late 1700s. The Catholic Church in Ireland did not allow this until about 6 years ago, and then in 2015, the records became available on the National Library's website. So this was huge when it came to research. This was like phenomenal that this would happen. So, all right, we go from there. This is what some of the Catholic records are going to look like. This dates back to 1757. As I mentioned, some of the places do date back quite a bit. This is from Cork City. And Presbyterian records, they also have the Presbyterian Historical Society of Ireland. And they have some records. Again, a lot of those on microfilm. So you'd have to go there. Belfast is a great city to visit, so, you know, I definitely would recommend taking a trip there sometime if you have Irish family. And indirect.gov.uk/crony is how you get to the Public Records Office. The Methodist and Baptist records, also available, as I mentioned. And I ran across Stuart Rosenblatt about 5 years ago, and we've talked back and forth. He now lives in London, but he started a database of over 62,000 now. He told me a couple of weeks ago it's like 64,000 now, of Irish Jewish citizens of Ireland that date back to the 1700s and go up. I think he told me now he's up to 2015. But it includes 32 Irish counties. And he had them all in he has them digitized now, but he had them on the book. And he has a book out, which I actually got a copy of it from him. It's called The Idiot's Guide to Irish Jewish Ancestry. So it's a great book. And an ongoing story. We'll Skype back and forth every once in a while. And I had a family member on my dad's side that came from a village that he mentions this lady in the book. And I'm not related to that lady, but she ended up going to Ireland, became a midwife, and was a very popular person in Dublin in the early 1900s. And she came to the same village that my Miller family came from. So it was like, wow, that was, and he said, they never lived in Ireland? And I said, no, they never lived in Ireland. And he said, oh, that's, yeah, I think it blew his mind. So that was, anyway, all right, let's go into English church records. And here's the National Archives. And the National Archives is a great site. It gives you a lot of information. They have poor law records that I mentioned. They have naturalization records, passenger lists. They have a lot of military records. If you had a family member that was even Irish and belonged to the English Army, you could find some information there. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of church records. They do have some, but they're not in their custody. It's usually in local custody. Again, so say like in this case, St. Margaret's, whoops, come on, be nice, there we go. It's like at Hoxted Park, the baptism records, it's in the Liverpool Records Office. So you can get on the Kew site, which is where the archive's located in England, and find out what records may be at the local site, and then contact that site and find out what they have available. Okay, one thing I did find is they have a Jewish petitioner's request to the king that dates back to 1290. So for people who don't think that records don't exist that far back, guess what? There it is. So if I get over there sometime, I'll take a look at it. But so you can also find a lot of English Catholic records, again, at Find My Past at Ancestry.com. They have those available. I don't know how much they have available, but they claim that a lot of the records are available there. French church records. I actually looked at stuff the other day, so it's not going to be in that paper, but a handout. But I found a site that's called Genealogist.org, and in there they talked about the National Archives in Paris and what's available and when they started. And you can see right here in 1539, King Francis I of France ordered the general keeping of baptismal and burial records. Marriage records had been introduced in 1579, so that was a little bit later after the first enactment of the baptismal and burial registers. Some of those, as I understand it, are available at the French archives. So for those of you who have French ancestry, and if you've never been to Paris before, you can look up, it's called francearchives.fr, pretty easy to remember. And that's what the main site looks like. So it gives you an idea of what you can see when you get over there. And that's what it looks like in the inside of the building. So it gives you a good chance to look through some records. All right. And this is, again, the website, so you can, I'll give you a second to write it down if you want. Any questions so far, what we've talked about? Okay. I'm doing that good, really? Okay. Now, we're going to get into some German records. Germany is a lot like Ireland and England, actually more like Ireland, in as far as many of their church records are in their regional archives. And you can find some of those records that are available. Some of them are digitized, some of them are not. And the Catholic records, some of those are not available. The Evangelical Church of Germany, you'll find some records there. United Protestant Church and Judaism, some Moravian Baptists and Huguenots. Some of those records are also available through the years from like the 1500s all the way up. In fact, you notice that some of these records, the Catholic religion and the Protestant Reformation is kind of what changed all that. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 brought recognition to the Lutheran faith, so you will start to see some of these records become more available. Yes?
Are you talking Germany as Germany is now, or are you talking Germany as it was here?
Right now, this is Germany as Germany is now. Yes. So if you go to Trier, or if you go to, let me guess another place, Darmstadt, the archives there will have some records from that particular region. And they'll probably be on microfilm. But, as Katie has found out too, there's also another site that's available that you can find some of these records. But some of these records go back to 1500. What I was going to mention too is, if you're like me, you get to the middle 1600s and you lose them. So what's going on? Part of the problem was this thing we call the 30 Years' War, and that caused a lot of people to move around, a lot. So a lot of our ancestors, my mother was one who always said that my one great-grandfather, they were all German. It went all the way back to, the beginning of time. They were all German. And when she did her DNA test on Ancestry, she found out it was only a transitory migration pattern. They were only there for what is now Germany for only about 200 years. And prior to that, they were somewhere else. I lose them in like 1630. And I found that some of them ended up in France originally, some of them were in Bohemia, which was also a German-speaking area. So you're going to find some of that because of different conflicts, diseases that went on at the time. People moved and they went to different locations. So that is one thing you're going to come across, and that's going to make your research a little more difficult, probably. This was a church in Walsdorf, which is up near Trier. It's actually north of Trier, near Down Eifel, near the Eifel Mountains. And I had some family members that were actually buried in the churchyard right behind the church. And they have, and especially a lot of the Catholic parishes, will have birth, marriage, and some burial records. This is a Catholic record from 1842, and this was the baptism of Nicholas Etten, and he was baptized 13 February 1842, and this was another perfect example of an individual who was born the day before, baptized the next day. So we knew what was going to happen. If something were to happen to him, you would see that he went to heaven. And that was the whole idea behind it. So this is a legitimate son, filius legit, Johannes Petri Etten. That was the father, John Peter Etten. He was a farmer, and Anna Katharina Zender was the mother, and they lived in Walsdorf. And the witnesses and the people that were there, Nicholas Etten and Christina Schlau, and they were both from Walsdorf. Yes?
I have a question. I stumbled upon, I think through Ancestry, they have some of these German church
Yes.
records, and they're all in a foreign language. So how are we supposed to translate them to actually know if they're,
I use Google Translate religiously.
and they will
And
translate the handwritten?
Well, no, you have to kind of jot down what you think the wording is,
Okay.
and then translate it that way. It works fairly well, or
Okay.
you take up German at Fox Community College, you know, that's one way of doing it. This is also, and again, you're at the mercy of the pastor, and if you notice, there's a little question mark. And the reason the question mark is there is because they left, and they went to the US afterwards. In some cases, you'll see a little cross next to it, and that meant that that person died there. May have been a child that died quite young, and then you know that that person is probably in the book somewhere, because that priest probably went back from the burial and looked to see where the person was baptized and put a cross there. Yes?
I think the group should be aware, and I don't know if they are, Family Search in Salt Lake has what they call communities. There's a Polish
Yes.
community and a
Yes,
German
they do.
community.
That's a very good point.
And if you have not availed yourself of that, it's a free service.
Mhm.
You can upload your document in German, and they will translate it for you. And
Yeah.
my experience has been you will get a translation probably within 48 hours.
Yeah.
And then on their published source, which comes up like for me every Sunday morning about 3 a.m., they will list your request and the
For the week.
translation
Yes.
again for the week.
Uh-huh.
And I think there's one for France, but I
There's also one for
subscribe
Ireland,
to
too. Yeah.
the Polish one and the German one, and they're excellent people. A lot of young
Yes.
from BYU. you know,
Yes.
and they're really sharp. I mean,
Um,
they'll give you a literal translation of your document.
And they will also add people who get on there and request information. Do you know anything about
Right.
Jack O'Reilly? He was my second great-grandfather, and he left Belfast in 1856. Somebody underneath that will respond and say, did you look at this record? And that's a very good point.
And you'll be
Thank you.
you'll be surprised to find out also that
And
there
you
are
can-
people looking for the
And
same
you can have the wiki,
source.
and they'll direct you to that location as well. Yes, you had a question?
Oh, I just, that term of legitimate, is that something?
Yes.
Catholics?
Somebody,
They're not Catholic
yes, that is,
ancestors.
if they were illegitimate or they were maybe adopted, perhaps, they may be called natural, the natural family member. If they're illegitimate, trust me, I've seen it where it says the illegitimate child of so-and-so.
Catholic records?
Yes.
Or- Oh, interesting.
I've seen where it says illegitimate, and when the parents marry, they go back and put the dates in, the child is now legitimate.
They will, yeah, and depending upon how nice the pastor was about doing something like that. Yeah, I've seen that too. It just depends upon the person who wrote it, yes.
In relationship
Mhm.
to that, there's also, I ran across recently, I think it was called Bastardly Bonds in
Mhm.
North Carolina,
Mhm.
where the woman had to list the father. So you can also find that.
Yeah, and that was, this was not just Germany either. You'll find this in a number of different records here in, as you mentioned, here in the US as well. Yes?
So I actually found a death record
Uh-huh,
in Germany,
uh-huh,
but they died here in Acton, Wisconsin.
uh-huh. Yes,
So
yes.
you,
And when you can find the location, because sometimes in the death record, you'll see the location, you can look back in the German
so they
record.
still, yeah, they still have
Yes.
family there, so they
Right.
notified them they died
Yes.
here, and they're in their
And
register.
they're registered, right, yeah, because somebody probably over there knew about what happened, and they went and told the priest, and the priest then marked it down that that person died. In this case of Nick, they don't know what happened to him. That's my assumption of what he did, was that was a question mark. So they left, and I know this, they left in 1848, so they left about 6 years afterwards. So, yes?
How did you know that, somebody you were talking about before, were in the workhouses? How's that traced?
There are workhouse records,
Oh, there are.
and you can, in fact, some of them are indexed, and you can find those workhouse records, and I think in Find My Past, you can actually call up the name and the record will pop up. In the case of, I think Indian and Family Search, they have workhouse records, because I was looking through some of them about 6 months ago, and I believe that was where I found a couple of them. I looked at index, but then when I knew they were in the workhouse, then I went to the Q site and started looking through some of those records in the workhouse. Yeah, that's the National Archives of England.
It's what?
The National Archives of England. Yes.
Repeat what the Utah website was, or Utah.
Oh, Family Search? Yes.
Is that what it was?
Yeah, so it's familysearch.org, and that was the site that, if you can go right into that site. If you go into their wiki, and when you get in there and you pull down to one tab, it'll actually say, it's like Family Search Wiki, and you get in there and you're looking for an English record, they will actually lead you then to the site this gentleman was talking about. Yeah. Okay. How we doing? Yes?
I just want to make note that she had asked about reading German records, and
Yes.
there was a book that's really helpful that the library has. It's called Deciphering Handwriting in German Documents. And they even have like the Latin ones, because
Mhm.
obviously there's Latin
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Latin,
yeah.
so
You have it up at the library,
we have it at the library.
Mhm.
Latin ones too?
Yes.
I was,
And I've seen other ones for other languages too.
yeah, I took Latin for 2 years, so that helped a little bit, sort of, you know. All right, but anyway, all right, let's get into, this is an older record. This is a marriage record that dates back to 1714. You don't get a lot of information, but it does confirm that they were married in this particular church on that date. So it dates back to 21st of November. If you notice that, that's the 9th month of the year, so 9 BRIS is how it, and then you see the 21, kind of hard to see there, but Nicholas Miller and Katharina Anna, and they came from around Down, that area, Down Eiffel. And this is from the Church of St. Nicholas in Down. So that's, as you get further along into the records, all right, now these are Protestant church records. I always pop this up and everybody goes like this, you know, and it's German script, and this was Christian Wilhelm Anthus and Anna Maria Schmitten. So you have what's the S looks like a V, and you get into where the child of that individual is, there's always going to be like an IN after it, so it's Schmitten, the child of whoever the father was in this case. So anyway, that was in 1814, and they belonged to the evangelical church in Zwingenberg. So that gives you another site, and this is an English site, and this is what we were talking about, is the archeon.de, I'm sorry, DE, and they have a portal where they have German records. These are mostly Protestant church records, and they're available online, and you can call it up by, when I got into it, I called it up by parish, and also by name. I think there's a name index on that too. Been on it a few times. And yes?
My Protestant
Mm-hmm.
family lived in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
but all their records were from Polish,
Okay.
Poland.
Uh-huh.
So they must have, like.
Well, yeah, keep in mind that Germany has only been around for a little over 100 years, you know, and prior to that you had these provinces and kingdoms that made up what is now Germany and what is now, even the Czech Republic and Austria, Hungary, and parts of Poland, and which was made up some of these areas. So and this was the thing I was trying to tell my family. This great-grandfather came over before Germany became Germany. He always looked at himself as a German American, but he was never in Germany at the time, when it was German. So those are things you have to keep in mind too, especially when you look at family stories and stuff, and that kind of blew some of my family's minds too. But anyway, it was, you can get onto this site, and they do have 90,000 church records available. And again, these are all the Protestant churches in Germany. Anybody else? Okay, let's keep moving. This is kind of an idea of what the site looks like and where you can find some of these records. And this just gives you an idea of the different archives. Hildesheim and Rhineland Archive, looked up some records there. Munster, and there's a few others. And so now we get into Bohemian records, and some of my family came from this. Bohemia was a kingdom at one time. It is now part of the western sections of the Czech Republic. It is German-speaking area because, and it dates all the way back into the 16th century, I think, something like that line. They have a record online, a site online, and it's called portafontium.eu. And unfortunately, most of the records are in either German or Czech. Those are your two choices. But you can kind of find your way through it, and it's a pretty decent, I think, site. Once you get used to how the pastor wrote. This is one that goes back to 1749, and this is the baptismal record of an ancestor of mine whose name was Dorothea Pala. And you can see she was Baptist, and they came from the village of Astra. So we'll do a case study here. My little case study involved a letter that I had written to the archive back in 1995 before the site even became available. And I was asking about an ancestor who died in 1763 at the age of 38. And they gave me, believe it or not, they gave me all this information, which was like, mind-boggling. And I thanked them. Of course, I had to pay. It was one of those times where when you did this, you had to pay the Czech embassy in Washington, and then they mailed you the information back. Yes?
Did you write the letter in English?
I wrote the letter in English.
And they answered you in Czech?
And they answered me in Czech.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so that went through probably the Czech embassy in Washington before it actually ended up in my house. So, but anyway, they don't do this anymore because all the records are now available online. But this is kind of where it all started. And so I got the information I needed, and then years later I went in to try and find some other information. This is the burial record of Dorothea Gibbets, who died in the parish of, I'm going to say, Verpenice. And they were actually, the church was there. They lived in Nerzan, which is a little town not too far away. And she died in 1763, the 1st of April. She was the wife of Johannes Gibbets, and the surviving widow, Johannes, and he was a peasant from the village of Nerzan, and her soul is with the Almighty God. Her Catholic body is buried, and she was 38 years old. And I thought, wow, that was kind of interesting. I wonder what went on with that. And so something kind of made me curious about it. So I looked into some other records from the same parish, and I found a little after that in Nerzan, in the year 1763, the 14th day of the month of April, Wenceslaus, the son of Johannes Gibbets, the peasant from the village of Nerzan, together in the home with the mother's soul. So he died right after birth, and his soul and body has been returned, and he was only 15 days old. It's not over yet. I found another one. He had twins. And he died 4 days later. And so in 1763, the 18th day of the month of April, Albertus, the son of Johannes Gibbets. Can you imagine what this village was going through at the time? I mean, I sat there and when I realized this, and I was like stunned, you know. I mean, this is genealogy. This is what it's all about. You're finding stuff that nobody would ever dream of looking at, and you discovered this. That's the bingo that you come up with. I mean, it's a very sad situation, especially, well, my ancestor was the older brother of these two twins, so it's still an interesting scenario to come up with this. So, what happened? Wenceslaus, I found their baptismal and birth record. They were born the 31st of March. This was a situation, they were born and baptized on the same day, so they knew there were probably problems. And then the next day, mother died, she's buried, 38 years old. A couple days later, the first child dies, and then a few days after that, the second child dies. So, that's what you can find in some genealogy records. Interesting little tidbits like that. So when you contact a local church, what do? My inquiry has always been, they're not there to answer genealogy questions. I know that, okay? So I'm gonna be very polite, courteous, very patient with them, give them a lot of time, make a contribution to the church, and tell them, especially if they're a European or Canadian church, or French Canadian, someplace like that, where they may not know too much about what goes on here in the US and how big a deal it is, get a hold of them and then offer to make a donation. And I would usually, you might have to do an international money order, especially if you're sending out to Europe, someplace like that. How do you find out, and we talked about this earlier, what church your ancestors belong to? Here's usually what I do. Look for an obituary if you can find it. Look at newspapers.com if you can find it, the original obituary. Then check the city map directory, Google Maps. We can get down to street level. If you know from the census record and from possibly the church record or from another civil record what location that person came from. Say the 1900 census will say on the side what street they lived on and what the address was. All right, get on Google Maps, zoom in on that area, and then look around and see what church might be around in that area. Or check, as I mentioned before, check if they were Catholic, check the archdiocese. Find out if they have a research map of all the parishes within an archdiocese or diocese. That will help you out as well. So, you get the local library may have a name index, which could help you out. And I mentioned one of the sites that I started using not too long ago, but you have to be a member of that too, a subscription, is britishnewspapers.cu.uk. And that will come up with some strictly English, Irish, Scots, Wales area, but it will also give you some help. Newspapers.com will also provide you with some American, Canadian, and also some European newspaper articles. So if a person died in an accident, it may show up in the newspaper in the 1800s. I've seen that a few times as well. Family Search will also have some newspapers that'll pop up as well. Not Family Search, but Ancestry.com will have one. So you may come up with like the British newsletter of 1800. You may find that on Ancestry.com, but Newspapers.com may have another newspaper with a different article about it. So, any questions up to this point? No? I do have one thing I was going to mention, and I had put it on here and it didn't show up, is that somebody told me the other day that genealogists always ask a lot of questions and take a lot of names and drive your family crazy. So, congratulations, you're all in the same boat. Okay, who had a question? Yes?
You mentioned maps, and that was one of the things that I wanted to ask about. Do you have any resources that you like or recommend for trying to find like old maps of old villages and towns and things? 'Cause
In the US, you mean, or Europe? I mean, Google Maps, that's the one thing I use, because I had, in fact, the other day when I found this record in Ireland, I went down on Google Maps and went down to the street view just to see what this area
They haven't
was.
changed the streets, so my problem
Yeah.
I run into, like even with New England, is that, you know, people live down streets that don't exist anymore.
Right, yes,
So we're gonna find
yeah.
old maps, I was
Yeah, oh, well, yeah, you can look at a plat map too, and you might, depending upon what area that they were in, check with that local library and see if they have the plat map. I mean, like, you probably have them here
Yep.
for Outagamie County. We have them up in Green Bay as well at the library. In fact, they have for like Fond du Lac and.
Yeah, we have most Wisconsin counties at the
Sure,
library.
yeah, and they will change, obviously, from, say, 1888 to 1905 or something like that. So you'll see a change in the area, but the plat map would be a good way of doing that. The one thing, some online maps, and again, I have to refer back to the Irish, Ask About Ireland, when they talk about the Griffin's valuation, they have a map where you can actually superimpose the Griffin map from 1846 and put it over a present-day map. So you can kind of see what's going on. There's some sites that are like that. I can't, there's another site I was on recently, but I can't remember what it is. But anyway, Google Map will also, if you have an idea of what that area looked like, you can take a look at Google Map, go down to maybe not street level, but close as you can get, and see if you can find the area of the road, what the road looks like, and then kind of zoom in from there. So it takes a little bit more time, but sometimes you can be successful at that. Yes?
This is off the really loose a little bit.
Sure.
Do you know what the legalities of like hospital records are? Can you ever get?
In the U.S.,
You know,
nil.
1900.
Yeah, and the reason for that, and I've checked, especially if you're looking at like asylum records, where a person who may have died like in the late 1800s and early 1900s, my understanding is with HIPAA laws that they go with the person after they're dead and you can't get access to them. Now, there may be a difference. I have tried to do that in Illinois, and I had to go to a state office, and the assistant director of that department allowed me to find out when this person was admitted into an asylum in Rock Island.
Yeah, Winnebago Mental Health
Mhm.
Institute, if you can show your lineage back.
Right.
My grandma did some visits there in the 50s for shock treatment.
Yeah,
And kind of against the rest of the family's will.
yeah, found out,
Because
yeah.
I'm a genealogist,
Yeah.
I did the record.
Right, yeah.
So it wasn't easy, but
Yeah, it's possible, but as this one guy in Springfield told me that it goes with you when if you can, like you did, prove the family lineage and prove that you're not doing it. And I think, yeah, in Illinois' case, you actually have to prove that you're not going to publish this. Then they may give you some of that information. It's, yeah, in Canada, that's not the case, but in the United States, that is.
Isn't that a matter of public record?
No,
No.
it's a private record. Mhm.
I mean, after they got,
Yeah, that's still private.
I did try to get, checking an asylum in West Virginia,
Mhm.
because I heard my grandmother had went there.
Mhm.
It had closed,
Yeah.
of course. I couldn't get it.
No, one thing you can find is the death record will tell you when that person got discharged, which would have been at the date
Well,
of
that's
death.
what I mean.
Yeah, you can find a death record, and that will tell you that that person was residing in that facility.
So
That's public. But as far as when they were admitted, and when they were in there, and what they were doing while they were in
That's
there.
what I meant.
Yeah, yeah. But the death record would be public. Yes.
I used to work at Winnebago, and we maintained all the records.
Have you?
From patient one through yesterday's admissions. And you're correct, you can do that, I've done it myself as a
Mhm.
private citizen, you can prove lineage, and they will find the record.
It's
for you. There's a
still
minimum
not
fee of
easy, though. Yeah.
$650, yeah, but that's Winnebago, but.
And each state probably has different law regulations when it comes to that too, I imagine.
There's so many different reasons that people were admitted there, and back in the day,
Right,
it was more.
right.
even.
And you may not be related to that person, you're just doing this for a book. You know, and I think they're probably concerned about that. Yeah, it's a good point. Yes?
Would asylums list, who the patients are on census records?
Yes, they'll be
So you
listed
could
on a
find-
census
find them
record,
in
yes.
census
So
record,
there is another
knowing
way
that
of
they're-
finding it.
that they're
I mean,
there.
if you look in like a 1900 census, and you'll find that the person, and it depends on how they phrase it. It may be considered like the state hospital you know, but if you know that that person was there, you can always look at that particular census and understand that they were still a resident of that facility. Yes?
About, divorce records.
In really,
10 or whatever.
that's another one of those,
But how do you trace it?
you have to check with each diocese, and in fact, and the diocese would probably hold that record, if I remember correctly. They may not be in the holdings of the particular church parish that they were in at the time. I would check with the diocese or the archdiocese if they were Catholic, or check with the, you might check with the library at that location, and you might check if they were like a Protestant church, to check with the pastor of that church and say, can you tell me what might have happened to those records? And at some point, you may have to contact the parish or the church pastor or the secretary of the church and find out what they know and where they can find the records. They may be available depending on the location. Yes?
I'm just wondering about, for the Lutheran records, I see you have the ELCA down here. Are any of the other synods, have they done anything with the?
That was the only one I could find. They might be, and I just don't know. I didn't find it, but yeah, that was the other thing too, is that depending on the synod, that you're going to have another different set of records that are available. So again, like I was saying at the beginning of this, you know, you may find this, oh wow, this is really neat. I'm going to go out and see what I can find. I know where you're going to go. Oh, this was depressing, you know, because those records just aren't available, you know, and yeah, that's a good point. That was the only one I could find.
This blue book over here goes through each of the synods and everything.
Oh, okay.
Each of the religions. It's really awesome.
There's a book.
Yeah, it's the U.S. How to Find Your Family and U.S. Church Records.
Wonderful.
I've had good luck with Lutheran records contacting the church if it's still there.
Yeah.
And they won't let me see the records, so I had to find some kind person that would do the work for me. And then they send me the records.
And normally, if you call ahead of time, sometimes you can get. I've done that a few with a particular parish, and I'll talk to the secretary, and you send a letter with a $10 check or whatever if it's in the U.S. and you'll get a nice response. Do you mind if I send you a letter and would it be okay? I'm looking for this individual, and if they remember you when they get the letter, then sometimes you'll get a good response. I had a situation. I had a bet going with a friend of mine when I was being confirmed at St. Jerome in Chicago, and we had a Polish bishop that did the confirmation. I remember Bishop Rodi had died here, and Bishop Wojcysław had left Chicago and come up. Bishop Wojcysław was supposed to do the confirmation for us, and he had to come up to Green Bay. And so we had a Polish bishop who was visiting at the time, and he didn't know any English, which was great for us because he didn't ask us any questions, you know. I got through that thing like, that was probably the thing I was scared about the most. And the funny thing was he had to catch a plane that night to go back to Poland. So we went through this thing like really quickly. But I had a bet going, and he said, "Do you think that was John Paul II?" I'm going, I don't know. I never even thought. I don't even remember what his name was. So I called the parish that I belonged to, and I talked to the lady, and she goes, "Well, it's going to take me a couple of days to find it." She found it, and it wasn't. So that was an interesting story where you get a hold of the parish secretary, and I sent them a nice contribution to the church. So that was all right. Anything else? We have gone a little bit past, but thank you very much for showing up. Great questions.